Welcome to the Needy and Normal podcast. I'm your host, Ashley Levering, mom, wife, and life coach. After hours of coaching and learning from my own life, one thing is clear: meeting your needs is essential for a better life. Here, we'll talk about your needs and not only learn to accept them, but also tend to them without guilt. Let's get needy. Welcome back to the Needy and Normal podcast. I'm excited to welcome in Carly Ritt to the podcast. Thank you for being here. I'm going to let you introduce yourself and tell our listeners how we know each other.
It's so good to be here. Thank you for having me. I am Carly. I am coming to you from Connecticut by way of Wisconsin. I still very much so identify as a Wisconsinite. And I am a mom of two. I have a self-published children's book and I work in marketing and communications during the day. We had the pleasure of meeting. I was going through all of our notes and emails to think through when we actually started working together. It was the end of 2022. And I felt very fortunate that a girlfriend had recommended that I reach out to you as I was pursuing finding a therapist in the area, but I was navigating a lot of change at the time. We had moved cross country away from our family. I had started a new job. It was a different team structure than I had ever worked on before. And it was so many new ways of working, just overall flow. I feel like we kind of flipped our life on a 180. And I did not have a toolbox, if you will, to navigate all of these changes at once. And I was pretty much in a constant state of overwhelm. And I was so excited when I reached out to you so that we could just start the 12-week session. And it felt like a really good time to jumpstart going into a new year. So then we got to work together for about 3 months.
I love it. I was so excited to work with you. Carly was my high achieving people pleaser who hadn't had that question asked of you. What do you want? And I remember that was a big shift for you.
What do you want and what do you need?
Yeah,
I
and
will
what do you
never
need?
forget. That was our first call, and I just stared at you blankly, and I was like, I think this is why I'm here.
I
We
honestly,
can figure that out.
I think that's exactly what that moment was like, because I remember your face was just blank.
I was like, I'm really good at telling you what everybody else needs. Don't you want to know what
Yeah.
everybody else needs? And you were so good at constantly reframing, refocusing me so that I could actually start to answer those questions because I couldn't, which was like my big shake of reality, I would say, that I was like, whoa, I cannot keep operating this way.
Does that feel like a long time ago now?
It does. And that's why I was looking at the emails because I was thinking it was actually 2021, but it was 2022. So we're at like a year and a half, but it really does feel like a lifetime ago. And I need a better way to talk about it because I know we had our sessions that were really focused during that transition. I still see a therapist regularly. To me, they worked very hand in hand. And I kept our sessions really focused on finding my own voice again, figuring out what routines I needed and how I wanted to show up at work. And then in therapy, I've navigated loss throughout my life and I was really focused on that in therapy. And a lot of times there was definitely crossover. I would start to be like, I can't remember if I talked about this in therapy or coaching. A lot of times when I'm still in my therapy sessions, I'm like, old me would have been like XYZ, but new me, or sometimes it feels like Wisconsin Carly, Connecticut Carly. But it really does feel like a lifetime ago. I feel like I went through a lot of emotion of, I'm trying to think of how to even phrase it, of like, I just want to give that version of me a hug and be like, you were doing everything you could and what you thought was the right thing to do. It wasn't wrong, but it was also not helping me as an individual to then show up in a better way in all facets of my life. So it's like old me, but I don't know. I need to come up with something that feels a bit more like a negative connotation. And it's not a bad thing, but I do feel like there was definitely a turning point that felt like a newer chapter starting that January of 2023.
Mm-hmm. Well, and I saw the difference before I pushed record, and I'm full on noticing this shift that's obvious to me because you said the words more than once, even in just the initial part of our conversation, I don't want that, or I want
Yeah.
that, or this matters to me now. And so you're just very sure. And that was something I remember we worked on is you had all these ideas. You're such a brilliant person. And it was just let me focus and figure out what I really am sure about and what really
Hmm.
fits me and what makes sense to me. I want to mention this really fun because your Instagram account is very popular. People love what you post because you post a lot about clothes and decor in your home. Your home is beautiful. Go check out Carly's account. And people love that. But I think what people also love is how real you are. You talk about how hard motherhood can be or how you didn't make the greatest meal, that day, even though everything she makes looks delicious.
There's
But
been a lot of burned items lately, but it is what it is. We're trying.
oh, always learning and growing. But you're kind of in live time through your posts, you're showing growth and the beauty of life, but there's very much that tone of here's what's real. And sometimes, things aren't as perfect as the picture frames, hung on my wall. And talking about the real stuff. When you think of that person a year and a half ago and your kids were littler, what mind you, they're still little, but
Mhm.
what do you think has been, if you could put one or two things down on a sheet of paper, what do you think has changed the most for you in this last year and a half? And then I want to go farther back.
Yeah. I think really, I would say finding my own voice again, because I can't remember if you said pick a word, but I know that's a phrase. But I found myself, especially after motherhood and then navigating grief, but then to like go back to motherhood, I just feel like there's so much content to consume at all times. And if you're in a fragile mental state, you can consume that in a way that is like convincing you that you should be feeling that way about something, or that you should tackle something this way because it's working for that person. And I think it becomes a clouded point of view almost. And then instead, it was also as I was navigating grief and being a first time mom and then having a second kid during the pandemic, I just feel like there was a lot of insecurity or questioning a certain way to do something, or that I had anxiety without really realizing it and feeling like I needed to fill every minute of the day instead of focusing on what I was actually thinking or processing. That was something I realized in our sessions. I thrive on being able to talk through situations aloud, but wasn't making the time for that personally. Even just with like journaling, I've stopped and started so many times. And then I know you said we'll go back, but even like as I was navigating my mom having passed away, and when I went back to work, I had a longer commute. It was like 45 minutes one way. I would fill the commute every single time, just like talking to other people instead of sitting with my own feelings. So I think right now, I feel so much more clear on what I actually want and what works for me without feeling like I need to adjust it because somebody else said that this would be better. And that gives a lot more freedom when you're one of the biggest things from our sessions was that I started my morning routine, and it didn't need to be an hour long workout video. Like I just do a few sun salutations and yoga and stretching, and then ideally I'm having a sip of my chai before the kids wake up. It doesn't always work out that way, but it got to a point that if my kids are waking up early, they knew we would be doing yoga and stretches and they would start to do it too. And what was really refreshing was then seeing how I could model that. And I think as a mom, to realize I need to show up for myself to also set that example instead of just saying one thing and doing another. They were truly seeing me prioritize myself. Again, I would say that's like a best day. It doesn't always look like that, or realizing when I'm fully tapped out. And I'm still a work in progress on asking for help. I really wish people could just sense my state of overwhelm and be like, Carly, what can I do for you? But I know better now that I have to say this is what I need. and then
Mhm.
to explain it clearly. Not and that was another really big piece that I feel like we worked through and that I've been processing the last few months of I really want because I would say one of my superpowers is being able to read a room and being like, "Oh, that didn't sit well with someone. This is what they might need," or to proactively be like, "Do you want me to jump in on that call or something?" And waiting for others to do that for me. But I know better now that I need to tee that up. It took me a while to get over that because I really just wanted it to be different and I wanted people to be able to read my mind, especially when you're in the thick of it, when you're all consumed with grief, or you are just so overwhelmed and you are overstimulated, like touched out. You don't want to make another decision for any other humans. That can be really hard. But it does, once you're in a better state to then realize that and actually know what your needs are to be able to communicate it, is a very different story. And I think that's what can be really hard navigating grief or just when you're in a new phase of life, even we move cross country. You can get so overwhelmed that to even think through what you need is really hard. And I think that's where when we came to these sessions, I was like, I don't know right now. And I was more comfortable saying that. It was really uncomfortable. But I think there was a phase of like you watch people on the internet who are so crisp of like, this is what I want to do. And I was like, I also have just had like a squiggly career path and I kind of like changing it up. So I think realizing what I want to do next, or that it's okay that I might not know, but I want to figure out what my current needs are, short term versus long term, to start that conversation, then allowed me, especially when it comes to communication, which was one of my major focus areas, to communicate better across the board, personally, professionally. And it has helped so much. And to be able to then guide my kids how I hope they can then communicate down the road. Like, yes, they're 5 and 3, but I do think a lot of these tools are things that then I can transfer to them just in different ways because they're different ages.
I love that you mentioned prioritizing and obviously listening to your own needs and how communicating was so important. And it wasn't just with, well, it was mostly with yourself. Let me talk to me.
Yes.
Let me figure
Yeah.
out what's happening in here. And
Hmm.
then externally, how am I showing this to the kids? How am I showing up for other people? And I love what you said about when you're in a room of people and you can figure everybody out. It's I can care without taking responsibility, which is something I
Yeah.
think you and I've talked about. That is something I am a huge, like I talk about that all the time. You can care, and this is always for my people pleasers, but you don't have to be in charge or responsible for other people's feelings and all that. So I'm glad you brought
Right.
that up. And this voice you're finding, right, is more steered inward, which I think there's this big myth about if you are looking inward and figuring out what do I need, what do I want, how do I not have to show up for people, that it's like this weakness or this, it's like being mean. And that's not it at all. It's this belief that people attach to. And you've just walked us through how it doesn't have to be like that. And I appreciate that because this permission, right? The permission you've given yourself. This is something that came up a bunch for us.
Yeah. I do think it helps a lot on the bad days, especially.
Mm,
Like I'm still a helper by nature. I want to. I've learned that
sure.
I need to ask people, do you actually want my help or do you just want me to listen? Because I love giving like 5 to 10 things they could do immediately. But
Yeah.
sometimes that's not the vibe.
Yeah.
I think it's really helpful because it's on the bad days or when you're feeling really irritated or bitter, or it helps me understand why I might be feeling that way and that more of it might be in my control than I realized previously.
Mm,
And so for me, it helps in those smaller commitments I make to myself. I still I still like being able to read a room the way in which I can. And I know I want to be a supportive friend in different ways, but I do think there's different ways that I have not taken on the full or felt like I've had to take on the full responsibility without anybody asking that of me.
mhm. Yeah, that's fair. You're managing yourself differently, but still you. So I'm glad you mentioned that. You can still be you and your tendencies can still be there. as long as you're noticing what they're doing or managing it differently if necessary. That's a really important thing to bring up.
Yeah, and I will say a lot of, and this really is the internal work. It's not like everybody can see some massive change. You can from that initial call from where I was a few years back, but it really is like muscle memory of when somebody sends a note, my immediate reaction is to read between the lines and think that they need XYZ or how am I going to over deliver as opposed to just being like, this is what they ask. What question might I need to ask back instead of assuming all of the emotion and probably making a scenario more challenging than it needs to be. So it really is relearning how to just approach an everyday occurrence in a way that is different than how I previously would have handled it. So there's been a lot of like, let me just pause and check myself for a beat to figure out if I'm reading the situation incorrectly or trying to do too much.
That's fair. I'm glad you mentioned that. I'm sure anyone listening can totally understand where you're coming from.
Yeah.
Okay, so let's go back a little bit. I know during our sessions, we were really focused on the now and the forward, and that's what coaching is, right? Let's talk about what you're working on, what you're struggling with, what you want to change, and what that's going to end up changing about your future. But let's go back because you've mentioned grief and managing that and what you've perhaps learned about yourself. But can you take us back to that time a little bit, Carly, if you're comfortable?
Yeah. I give this timeline, which can be a bit overwhelming. This is the crazy part of that. I used to have all of this at the tip of my tongue because it was just our lives when my mom got diagnosed with cancer. It was a year, it had to be 2013. And then we got married in 2015. My younger brother unexpectedly passed away in 2016. My mom passed away in 2017. And we found out we were expecting Ainsley in 2018. It was a really intense few years, a lot of highs, a lot of lows. Like I was thinking about this going into the interview today and talk about like wanting to give a younger version of yourself just a hug. I feel like there was truly a sliver of me that was convinced like telling my mom she's going to be a grandma would like somehow make the cancer go away. And it just, oh, it's still like guts me, but it is crazy. Like she passed away and within 30 days we found out we were expecting. It like still gives me chills and knowing we were bringing a new human into this world and how fortunate I felt that that was the case. But it was a lot. We also closed on our first home the November prior to her passing in December and talk about like social of people sharing things. And I try to share more of the real in real time. But I also feel like it's a balance. I don't want to like constantly post and have people just like feeling sorry for me. When I post, it's more that I just want to normalize that life is complicated and hard and you shouldn't feel bad for any of those things because we closed on our home. We rushed. Everybody always takes those photos outside of their house. And I was like, oh, we need a picture. But I actually rushed to the hospital right after we closed and we found out that the chemo was no longer working. And that was just like a conversation that I never played out as an eternal optimist. And my mom had proved like time and time again that she could beat all odds. There were very complicated situations along the way. And none of us played out that that conversation would actually happen. I was just like, no, my mom's going to be the one that we don't have to talk about that. So we rushed to the hospital, found out that wasn't working. And then we had this new house. And again, talk like two things being true in one day. And you're like, what is happening? And this is not how I anticipated all of this panning out. And we had the cable guy take our photo outside of the house. And we were just like, okay, this was exciting, but we need to like go find my mom again. And so that day was intense to say the least. And then I had fast forward to September and we had Ainsley, and there's so much joy in a newborn. And it was this bright light that we all needed in so many different ways. The piece that, I mean, I don't know if I ever could have been ready for it. I definitely had not processed most of my grief. And I am one that then notoriously like went back after my brother passed away. I went back to work and I just threw myself into work. It felt like the one thing I could control. After my mom, same thing, but then was also pregnant and trying to like prioritize resting and get settled in a new home. That took a lot of practice of like, your home doesn't need to look perfect immediately. I let so many rooms be empty, but that was a lot of like the unpacking what I saw on social versus what my reality looked like. And so we had Ainsley in September. Towards the end of that year, it was a late night or early morning, if you will. They all blurred together of when these words started coming to me. And I opened up my notes app on my phone of this, what has turned into my children's book, because I was not ready. I hadn't processed grief yet, but then to add on the grief of being a mom without your mom. And then there was like the grief of actually losing her, and then the grief of what you thought this would look like, which they are definitely different because, and I was going through them in different waves. And it was harder when I was seeing certain people with Ainsley. I was so sad, upset, mad, insert any feeling there of like, all I wanted was for my mom to hold her. And then I also am a firm believer in signs, which is part of this book. It's called The Angels in the Sky, and I know we'll talk about it in a bit, but these words all came to me. So I opened up my notes app and I had wrote the book in a way that I still remember. This was part of like when you're a new mom and they're like, entertain your kids. And I'm like, what am I supposed to do with a 3 month old? I don't know. And people are talking about like show them books. And you're like, okay. So this book is one that I more needed as a new parent, even more so than reading it to a newborn. So it's a sweet spot of being comforting for both parents and then also younger kids. And what I will say is that with the signs, that's where I started to find so much comfort. There's a lot of pain that goes along with it. But even when we were at the hospital, I they like closed the door and somebody had opened and they were calling for the tech Rosie, and that was my mom's name. And that was like right after we delivered Ainsley. And I was just like, Bill, did you hear that? And then for anybody who knew my mom or knows me personally or has seen on social, one of like the funny signs is when my kids give us the middle finger, because that was one of my mom's preferred ways to communicate, mostly with her siblings and her family as a joke. And when my sister came to meet Ainsley, sure enough, like one of the first pictures, Ainsley like put her hands on her face and is flipping us all off. And so we started to get these little signs that then were extremely comforting and gave you that sense of like, okay, she may not physically be here, but she's showing up when we are looking for her. And cardinals were that other sign for both her and my brother. And so the idea of this book is more about finding comfort in the signs from loved ones who are no longer physically here. And that was one of the, you now know me well enough that I don't do well when I don't have like a bunch of projects on my plate. I'm working on that. So I'm like, yeah, okay, let me process grief, have a newborn, and let me write a children's book. But I didn't know how to do any of that. So that all kind of went on pause. But I still was just like sitting there for the longest time. And I really believed that it could be a tool for others more than myself. And that's oftentimes why I'm still posting on social, just to normalize everyday lived experiences. Like everybody, unfortunately, has processed or will need to process grief at some point in their life. There will be a new, whether it be motherhood or struggling to become a mom or how you're navigating your career or you are moving cross country. Like there is always something big going on. And I think one of the things that I was then internally struggling with was that I felt like something may be wrong with me because I was feeling this way. And none of that was wrong. It was just how I was feeling. So I like to share those lived experiences and the ebbs and flows of the really hard moments, but the really wonderful moments, because I just think that's life. And if I can provide comfort, or somebody having seen a post that I shared or having read the book, of just not feeling alone or wrong in anything that they're feeling, like, to me, that's how I love to be a part of something that's bigger than just myself and my immediate family. And that's why I really wanted to bring the book to life. So then I had Liam in 2020. And again, of the talk about too many projects, I was like, oh, second time, mom, I got this. Let me figure out how to publish this book. And then that was where I self-published over the pandemic. And I'm still so immensely grateful. I ended up launching a Kickstarter. I made up every process, or every part of the process, the entire way. I had no idea what I was doing, but I was determined. And through a Kickstarter, which so many friends, family, friends on the internet contributed to, which is the sole reason that it is in existence today, helped bring that to life. And the little messages I get along the way are really what fuel the why behind it, because I don't have as much time to spend on it, although I have big ambitious goals for it. But even somebody messaged me that they brought the book to the hospital. And I'm like, I mean, there are only so many things that come to the hospital, or you're overpacking, but to know that somebody brought the book along with them is really super powerful. And it's where I'm still a work in progress. I don't navigate every situation in a perfect way when others are navigating loss. But what I've realized is that nobody knows what to do. And I didn't know what to do either. And to be able to help people who are both navigating loss, or people who want to support people navigating loss, has been this like sweet spot of, they know they could purchase the book. Or I've posted something of like what to say to a friend going into the holidays, because a lot of times it's more about people coming from a really good place but just not knowing what to do. So I'm still trying to share more while navigating my own grief, to see how I can help along the way with others who are navigating something similar yet very different. Every loss is completely unique, to figure out how I could help or just normalize the conversation along the way.
Thank you. Thanks for walking us through that. That's wonderful how you're normalizing all the feelings, all the lived experiences. Like you said, I love that you said lived experiences. Normalizing is part of what we're here for, right? Is you're a
Yeah.
human being, you're going to go through things. And grief doesn't just go away. You figure it out. It's not something you heal from and move on and then you're fine. And I know a lot of overachievers out there think, oh, I have to just figure it out. I have to be okay. And finding every which way to do that, like you said, throwing yourself into work and finding some control and learning from that and knowing that I can only control so much and I'm a human being and you can move forward. It doesn't mean you're moving on. You're just finding a way to live your life and inspire if you get to that phase. I love
Hmm.
that that is what happened for you. And I love that it became not just a project because you love your projects,
Yes.
but something of pure human influence where it's okay to go through the things and here's some comfort for you. And I also love how you mentioned it's not just loss of of loved ones, it's loss of what you thought things would look like. And
Hmm.
sometimes that's one of the biggest changes that we go through as human beings is we think life is going to be a certain way. And how nice for it to work out exactly the way you want it to. And sometimes that happens and it's amazing. And sometimes I had a friend mention this in her podcast. You buy a ticket to the Caribbean and you land in Holland and you get off the plane and
Yes.
you have to find a way to adjust and love this new place and figure out how to live there. And so I definitely feel like you've walked us through that today. It's, life isn't supposed to be perfect, but you're a really amazing example of what living a full life looks like while navigating challenging pieces of life. And you can still come out whole and you can still be growing and still figuring it out and still be okay.
Hmm. I will say in the past few years, in the earlier stages of grief, I was convinced I just needed to like, if it was a bad day, I needed to somehow try to make it better and then would spend all my energy on that. And now I'm just like, if it's a bad day, let it be a bad day. And I don't try to fix it. I'm like, we will try again tomorrow. And maybe that is still a hard day, but that's definitely been one thing that has been a shift over the years. And even as other people are having bad days, I would feel responsible for trying to fix their bad day. And I'm like, just let a bad day be a bad day.
Mhm.
Everybody can have a bad day where you're frustrated, mad, angry. And I struggle with letting myself have that. And a lot of time, even if it's whether it be that I'm missing my mom or brother or the kid, it was like a nightmare day getting kids to school or bedtime of just letting it be and calling it what it is, go to bed and try again tomorrow because
Mhm.
the lack of sleep, the frustration, like it's only going to be a buildup and there actually won't be something that can just like flip a switch. And so I fully lean into the bad days now. And I'm just like, or I know I like need to get some feelings out. And so I save some of my shows to like release the tears of it's not helping anybody, especially myself, to keep it all bottled up.
Yeah, no, that's really good. And yeah, it's that permission again. Just give yourself permission to own it. It is what it is,
Yeah.
and everything will still be okay. Nothing's on fire if you don't
Yeah.
fix it right.
Hopefully, knock on wood.
Yeah, exactly. That's a good point. But I remember also seeing one of your posts. You mentioned earlier about giving some words to someone, like how to ask someone what they need. And that was something you normalized too. It's like you don't have to say the right thing. You don't have to, try and I can't remember exactly what you said, but you gave some tips on how to talk to someone when you want to be supportive, but you're not exactly sure what they need. Can you walk us through just a couple of those? Because what worked for you? Like, what are the things that you've wanted to hear? Let's say you're having one
Oh,
of those
yeah.
bad days, right?
A couple things come to mind. If it's somebody who has recently experienced a loss, I still, even if I know that somebody passed away from cancer, like you just don't compare any of your losses. It is so unique to that individual to just, so to not bring up, I guess there's a few like what I would say and what I wouldn't say
Oh, yeah.
of don't try to compare it to anything else. And you just don't know what that other individual is going through. I think that was the biggest learning I had of even like my mom didn't lose her hair ever, and she liked not having people know what might be going on in the background. So you just don't even know, even if somebody's navigating this one loss, what else might be going on. The thing, and we talked about this at the beginning of the podcast of needing to know what you need, but when you're in like that moment of loss, anything that was an additional question that I needed to make a decision on. And if somebody's planning a funeral, like just don't add decisions to their plate. So I had, and this is where like I learned from my friends being incredibly supportive. And I would have a friend be like, I'm doing a Target pickup. What do you need from this store? Or can I get you Starbucks? Or like, I'm going to the grocery store or just doing. Like I had a girlfriend, we were still in an apartment and I had a girlfriend around the block and she just got the mail. Like she removed the daily tasks from my plate immediately. And it was the other thing about sharing, like I don't want this to come off as anybody's done something wrong if they've done this previously, because any type of outreach is still so thoughtful. It's better than hearing nothing, that's for sure. And so I never want people to be like, oh my gosh, I did that. I can't believe I did that. I'm just trying to share what did work for me. And when people ask, I always say, you do know the person best. Or you could ask a question that even though it's still giving an answer of like, do you want to talk about it right? Do you want to talk about it right now? Or would it help if we talk about something that has nothing to do with this? Of like to either get it's back to like the toddler questions of like, do you want to put on your shoes now or do you want me to do it in the car? And not to trivialize it in any way, but giving two options is so much more helpful than an open-ended question. And that was the same of something I try to do just on a daily basis. The question of like, how are you? I know it's what we all tend to ask each other immediately when you get on a call, and that it can feel like such a big question to somebody navigating a really hard phase of their life to just be like, how did your weekend go? Or how was today? And just to make questions smaller can actually prompt an answer versus most people, unless they're like incredibly comfortable with you. If somebody was asking me, like, how are you? I'm like, oh, I'm fine. Of course, I'm not fine, but that was the fastest way to answer that question. I found things, again, it depends on how much you're trying to do, and you certainly don't need to like turn it up to 100 for every single person. But even just like sending a text saying, thinking of you, no need to respond, of like remove any action from their plate, no guilt. Somebody who was a people pleaser and felt the need to, I was truly so thankful and grateful for everybody who reached out. There just was not enough time in the day to be able to respond to everything. So having someone be like, okay, they're checking in, I don't owe them everything or anything. And I do feel like that's something I'm still working through, of like feeling like if somebody does a nice gesture for me, feeling like I need to pay them back. And now I've leaned into acceptance of like, I will take somebody thinking about me and I don't need to keep a scorecard. They're just good humans. And I'm fortunate to be surrounded by good humans. I think it's an interesting balance. I was reading something, it was a post about like people talking more about therapy and just overall friendships, to the point of like we've normalized certain types of conversations. And I do think there just still needs to be a human element. Like you shouldn't have to overthink it or feel like you have to draft something I said because that's what I said would work. Like it's meant to be a guideline of like, here's something you could say. But again, it's your friendship, it's how you communicate. And I still think that's the biggest piece of like, we're all humans. This sucks. You don't need to feel like you can fix somebody or their sadness. And so just showing up in a supportive way, and that can be a text or an email or a handwritten card, shows that you're thinking of them. I like to try to show or share those formulas to just help, because I think sometimes even I felt it with motherhood. I'm like, give me a script and I can thrive. Like, what am I supposed to do with a 2-year-old who's going absolutely crazy right now? So I'm hoping that's more of what I'm able to share, of like, here are some things that I thought about differently, having been the one that navigated loss. Here are some things I might say, but ultimately, like, be your own self and talk to the person who you have the relationship with in a meaningful way. I feel like I was processing the way I've been sharing things and how I don't want it to come off as like, you must do this, but hopefully it can be a tool that then helps others have those conversations.
Yeah, it's an amazing tool. All of those tools. I hope I'll put these in the show notes too. And because I know that that's helpful. And it's not just for loss, it's for any time you're going through a really challenging time. And I remember reading this, it's how are you doing today? It's being more
Hmm.
specific, like you mentioned. I use that now. Yeah, because I check in with my clients like I used to, you probably remember this. I check in with my
Yeah,
clients through text at least once between sessions. And instead of how are you doing and leaving it open-ended, it's because of you, Carly. Now I'm saying, how are things going today? How are you feeling about XYZ? Obviously, based on what we've talked about before, like you said, like, the relationship, you can, communicate, to the relationship and what you know of it. But it makes so much sense for whether you're going through something really, really hard, or going through a big change, or experiencing loss. It translates well to check in and be that person. But I love that you mentioned too, is you don't have to keep a scorecard. I've done that. As I say, I'm a recovering people pleaser. It's,
same,
there's always
same.
those,
Yes.
there's always those tendencies. But whenever someone does something nice for me, I always have this like itch to do something in return and make it better. And now, people can just be decent and kind, and you can do the same when it's appropriate, and it doesn't have to balance out. It's just, life and flow rather than keeping a score. I'm glad you mentioned that. So let's do this. I'm always curious. I've been doing this more now with finishing conversations on the podcast, where you've been through a lot and several chapters of going through a lot, and yet you're still learning and still growing, and also totally figuring out how to steer yourself and make decisions. And I mean, honestly, like, you're doing fantastic. And that's the thing that I want people to understand is when you tend to your needs and you normalize the human experience, things can get better, but they don't have to be fixed or perfect. That's not the point. But you're a wonderful example of going through hard things, changing careers, changing locations, like all the transitions you've been through. And yet you're navigating and managing and learning and growing and continuing to figure out how to be you, how to do your life. And you can still basically do fantastic. And it's a both and, which I love. I love a good both and have things that you face as a human being. And life's not always going to be roses. It's not supposed to be, but sometimes it is. And that's what I know you've mentioned more lately, is noticing the good stuff and picking up on those moments that, here's the good parts of life that you really want to be present for, and normalizing that too. It's things can be in flow and you can face something hard, but there's always going to be the wins. There's always going to be good things to pay attention to. There's so much life happening right in front of you. And so I want to know how you're steering today versus, and I hate to say versus because it is just flow and growing, but the Carly who went through loss and the book and all the things that have come from challenges, like what would you say? I know you would give her a hug, but what would you say or give tips? Like what kind of tips would you give to Carly those many years ago, now that you're standing here today with all this knowledge and abilities to figure yourself out? What would you say to her?
I do love that question. And I'm realizing part of it is one thing I'd probably still say to myself today because I and it's one of the things I got from my mom, and I'd probably want to say it to her too, of like, you don't always need to be so strong. And you can lean in fully to saying you're not okay or that you need help. It is not a badge of honor to get through something really hard by yourself because you're still getting through it. And then you can choose who you it's not that you need to open it up to the full public. I'm unique in that I share on social media. And I think part of that though is also my healing because I'm trying to talk about things I didn't talk about in real time and wishing I probably would have. And I I tend to put on that quote unquote brave face quite regularly. And I catch myself doing that even in front of my kids, but it's okay to show when you're upset or sad or missing somebody. So I think the piece about asking for help, I would say old Carly, that still was super hard because I'd be like, I don't even know what I need. So making that time and letting myself rest or just have the time to myself um, could have been really helpful. I would say the take time off, which I did. Both places I was working at the time were so incredibly supportive. And they were like, are you sure you want to come back? I'm like, yeah. It always feels like a good idea right at first. It's, I would say it's the month or two after when everybody else is going back to normal. I would say, like, don't be afraid to take PTO again. I know bereavement technically comes like right after a loss, but there's this really isolating time when you're like, oh, everybody else just gets to go back to what they were doing, even though they've been incredibly supportive. It can become really lonely really quickly. And I was not ready. I didn't feel ready to go to therapy. I definitely was when I moved out here. I think it's more about it's okay to do something if you don't fully feel ready, if it's going to help you later. And you don't need to have it all planned out of how you're going to start going into therapy and what you're hoping for after, but just to start doing something that is solely for you. And maybe that is a hobby, but it's something that you can do on your own to just have time with yourself. I think it can be scary to have time with yourself because then you'll start to feel the things you're maybe afraid to be feeling, but to just give time for yourself. And I do always say this, to my girlfriends of like, give yourself grace, but I'm very bad at following suit. And maybe it's because that feels too broad of like, what does that mean? Of like, just let yourself lay on the couch without guilt. Like, figure out if you want to go on a walk and close your computer. But those little commitments to yourself can make a big difference.
I love that. So it turned into, let me give everyone this advice, which is so,
I
but
guess.
it's so good. It's so good because you know it works for you. And when you experience something personally, it makes sharing it more meaningful because you've seen how it plays out. So I want to ask you a tender question to end things, if that's okay.
Yeah.
What do you think your mom is most proud of you for? And is it the same as what you are most proud of you for?
I would say it's both. I think my phase of motherhood and taking the leap of faith for our move, those are two items. If you would have asked me 5 years ago, like what year are we in? No, over 10 years ago, if we ever would have left Wisconsin, it would have been the fastest no. And it was the reason it was so hard was because we left all of our family. We have Bill has one cousin out here, but like we knew nobody. And that was a big bet on myself moment with all of Bill's support that I'm still so incredibly grateful for, and like fully leaning in and figuring out what our life as a family unit of four looks like, in addition to such wonderfully large families. So I would say that how I show up as a mom and parent, and the the children's book for me is so specific. I think the larger piece that I'm so proud of is just chasing down a goal that I really wanted to achieve, which I would say I get that resilience from my mom of like when she set her mind to something, get out of the way, which is a lot of what I have channeled. I'm now more open to probably asking for more help along the way. But I think I take a lot of that from her, and then just overall how she showed up and loved as a mom, of like taking some of that along with me to pass on to my kids.
Love that. Love that. Thank you. Okay, so how can people find your book? Can you tell us a little more about what they can find in your book and where to find it? And then how they can follow you on Instagram. Carly, I'm so glad we got to have this conversation.
Same. It's been so wonderful. I'm actually I don't know when this site will go or this episode will go live. I'm relaunching my site hopefully soon, but you can visit carlyritt.com. It is the only website that you can purchase from. It's available in two stores in Wisconsin and one in Connecticut. It is not available on Amazon, which is a frequently asked question. I still do all of the shipping and logistics from this office. And so you do need to order through carlyritt.com. And you can find me on social at Carly Ritt. Within the book, the way I actually had a friend provide feedback, which was really helpful. And she caveated it with, I know I haven't navigated loss, so maybe that's why I just don't get it, but like I don't really get the book. And I was like, I'm actually so glad you said that, because a lot of people who do understand it either contributed to the Kickstarter, but maybe they've found me after and just aren't like connecting the two. It's a really short and sweet children's book that is meant to be something you can start reading as early as a newborn. I would say 5 and 6 year olds would still find comfort in reading it, and then they might age out, but maybe it could be like something that they find comfort, find comfort pulling off the bookshelf again. It's really, I'm trying to think of, the end of it is they live on in our hearts and help us get by. So the idea is that we continue to get signs from our loved ones in the big moments and then those everyday moments. I feel like the everyday moments are what sneak up on me, of like when I was really missing my mom walking Ainsley to the bus stop. And I was like, I did not have that on my bingo card. Like it wasn't Mother's Day, it wasn't her birthday, it was just this everyday moment. that is where I find I'm like really living my life of those small moments with the kids. So it's meant to be a nod to those everyday moments of being open to seeing those signs and finding comfort in the fact that they may not physically be with you anymore, but they're still showing up along the way and they're with you in spirit. So that is the theme of the book. And it is really meant to provide that comfort for both the parent and the kid. And hopefully it can prompt some more conversations about a loved one you're missing. It's meant to more be a tool to have those conversations or talk about memories. Like my kids know Grandma Rosie and Uncle Kevy. I want them to know their names. I want them to hear stories. So hopefully it's just the first piece of what you're able to then share with others along the way. I do know people who usually read it on their first pass do tear up, but then when you read it again and again, it is more hopeful than saddening, which is what I want. Of course, I want people to feel whatever they may be feeling, but it really is meant to be like that feel good book that people can pull out before bed. And then hopefully, as you start to see whatever your signs are, it's a connection point to the book into real life.
Amazing. Thank you. Okay, so go find Carly if you want to continue being inspired by her story and what she's learned and what she's put out in the world. Thank you for talking to us today. And we'll talk again, I'm
I
sure.
can't wait. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening to the Needy and Normal podcast. If you liked what you heard today, please share this with a friend. And don't forget to leave me a rating and a review, and feel free to reach out. I'm on Instagram at ABL Life Coaching. If you're curious about coaching together, visit ablifecoaching.com.